The Jimmy Eat World to Lil Yachty pipeline is actually very real. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA. And if you turn back the clock to 2002, you may remember seeing a video on MTV of a house party with everybody in their underwear, jumping in the pool and making out in the closet, and a chorus that was absolutely insanely catchy by a little band called Jimmy Eat World. They may have not had the world's best name, but their songwriting was just undeniable. And along with bands like Dashboard Confessional, Taking Back Sunday, and The Used, they took a new genre called emo, put it on the map with a mainstream audience, and in the course of doing that, changed alternative music forever. And although the band never had another huge breakthrough hit like The Middle, the band has been going strong ever since, arguably the longest running, most consistent emo band of all time, and they've really earned their place as one of the most beloved bands of their whole generation. So the question is, how did they do it? How did they go from playing to 6 people in Cleveland to hitting the top 10 of the Billboard charts just a few years later? And most of all, what is their lasting impact and influence? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, did you know I have a second channel? Check it out if you haven't. It's a little bit more loose and fun. There's a link to that in the description of this video. And also, I gotta say, sometimes I feel like it's my job to save you guys from yourselves, because I do not want you, yes you, to end up as some kind of neckbeard. And that means you will need a great shave at an affordable price, which is why I am excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Harry's. They make super high quality shaving products at affordable prices, which they can do because they actually own their own factory in Germany, where they've been making blades for over 100 years. Harry's gives you everything you need at a super fair factory direct price. Nothing more, nothing less. They sent me their starter kit, which includes one of their very nice razors, this one, some of their shaving gel, and a blade cover. And since I work for myself, I could be an untamed wild animal with a 3-foot long beard, but you know what? Having a nice shave makes me feel better. And it's a nice bonus that my wife hates facial hair, especially the neck beard. So if you want to keep your inner neck beard at bay, just like me, click the link in the description of this video to buy a Harry's trial set for just $5. That's a $13 value for only $5. And thanks again to Harry's for sponsoring this video. Jimmy Eat World formed in 1993 in the Phoenix suburb of Mesa, Arizona. Started by Jim Adkins and their drummer, Zach Lind, who had been friends since they were like little kids. And if you've ever wondered where they got their name, it actually has nothing to do with Jim. It's from a drawing that Zach's little brother did of their other brother named Jimmy devouring the planet with the caption underneath, Jimmy Eat World. And the first time that I heard Jimmy Eat World was back in 1998 when my roommate dragged me to see them at Speak in Tongues in Cleveland. And there were maybe 50 people there at the absolute most. Because the honest truth is that even among the DIY emo scene in the mid-90s, the band was pretty obscure. But they had actually been around for a few years before that. They released their first self-titled album in 1994, which personally I think is really good, but it went basically completely unnoticed at the time, with only 2,000 copies ever being released. But the band kept grinding it out, and apparently somebody noticed, because they signed to Capitol Records in 1995 and released their major label debut, Static Prevails, in 1996, which, as the band put it, was released to deafening silence. The album was a certified flop, at least from the perspective of a major label, selling around 5,000 copies in 2 years, where in the eyes of a label like Capitol, success means selling hundreds of thousands or ideally millions of copies. So to say that the label was underwhelmed by Jimmy Eat World would be an understatement. And before I go on, I want to give a little bit of context for all the emo historians out there, because you might be wondering, how did this obscure little emo band end up getting a major label deal? And the answer to that question is basically 2 words: Nirvana and Green Day. After both of those bands blew up and proved that alternative music could sell millions of copies and hit the Billboard Top 10, the major labels essentially went on a feeding frenzy, hoping to find the next big alternative breakout band. With grunge and pop punk already essentially being fully exploited, they started looking to the emo scene, with bands like Jawbreaker and Jawbox signing to major labels, and other bands like Texas Is the Reason, Jets to Brazil, and The Promise Ring being courted by majors. And by the way, if you like really early Jimmy Eat World, make sure you check those bands out. Also, Game Face, Farside, and Braid as a couple other recommendations. And at the time, it seemed like emo maybe was going to have that same sort of explosion as grunge and pop punk did. But by the late 90s, it kind of became clear that none of those bands were actually going to become quote unquote the next big thing. And so it seemed like Jimmy Eat World would just be the next name on the list of underground emo bands that got signed and failed to break out. And Capitol, somewhat understandably, just wasn't prioritizing the band. And Jimmy Eat World's first big breakthrough actually came in 1998. Their contract with Capitol allowed them to also release EPs on independent labels, and so that is exactly what they did, including splits with some of the very best mid-90s emo bands like Christie Front Drive, Sensefield, and Mineral. They also did a split with a band called Jejune on Big Wheel Recreation, which was the same label as a lot of very legit emo and hardcore bands like Braid, 454 Big Block, and 10 Yard Fight. And I mention that because I think it's actually kind of underappreciated how much Jimmy Eat World really was a part of the 90s DIY emo scene, even though they were on a major label, and how that scene was itself really an offshoot of the hardcore scene. Insert the real emo copy pasta here. One of the other independent releases they did was a self-titled EP in 1998 on Fueled by Ramen, which at the time, years before Fall Out Boy and all that, was just another small punk label started by Vinny from Less Than Jake. And to everybody's surprise, that EP actually started to get some organic traction that finally made their label start to notice them. As their guitarist Tom said, "We put out that EP and some radio stations just started playing it, like K-Rock in LA. And Capitol had nothing to do with it getting played. So all of a sudden, all these Capitol people show up to our show and they're like, oh, you guys are our favorite band." It was kind of funny. And the band said that they were actually expecting to get dropped after Static Prevails, but now with at least some support from Capitol, they got one more chance and released their third album, Clarity, in 1999. And this album was by far the best thing they had done so far. For one, this is where Jim Adkins took over as the main vocalist and songwriter, which made a big difference because, with all due respect to Tom, who was handling both of those things before, Jim was honestly just a lot better. I should also give a shout out to their producer Mark Trombino here, who also worked with bands like Rocket from the Crypt and Mineral. He played in Drive Like Jehu, and by all accounts during those early years of the band played a really big role in their creative process. As Jim said, the atmosphere of the Clarity sessions was very encouraging for experimentation. I would think a song was totally finished, and then one of the guys in the band, or Mark, would bring up an idea that really closed the deal. For example, like the cello on Table for Glasses. And if you listen to songs like Lucky Denver Mint, which was the big single, it's clear that the band had not only reached a new level for themselves, but they were better than pretty much any other band in that late 90s emo scene, despite the fact that they were still a pretty unknown band. And although Clarity has since come to be regarded as like a definitive classic in the emo genre, and it did get positive reviews at the time, once again, it was a commercial disappointment, and as they had been expecting for a while, they were officially dropped from Capitol in the fall of 1999. And that would be the end for a lot of bands, right? They would say, hey, we gave it a try, but we got dropped by the label, let's just break up and go get jobs. But for Jimmy Eat World, this was really more like a new beginning. It was kind of a well-known thing in the industry that they weren't really happy on Capitol, so they actually had a lot of label interest. But without an actual signed deal with a label to pay for the recording, they went back into the studio in 2000, paid for it out of their own pocket. Labels stopped by to hear what they were working on, there was a little bit of a bidding war, and they eventually signed with DreamWorks, which was the music division of a new company started by some absolute giants like Steven Spielberg and David Geffen, and they released the album that would change everything for them, Bleed American. It came out in July of 2001, with the first single being the title track. Sonically, it was much more straightforward, upbeat rock than the emo sound of their earlier albums. And that summer, they also supported Weezer and Blink-182, as well as playing half of that year's Warped Tour. Things were looking up for Jimmy Eat World, until the entire world stopped on September 11th, 2001, with the New York City and Washington, D.C. terror attacks. And this was a really tricky time for bands because it was so hard to know what to do. Would it be crass and inappropriate to put out new music and keep playing shows? Or, on the other hand, is music exactly what people need to help them get through this trauma? It was genuinely difficult to say which one was right. But ultimately, Jimmy Eat World decided to keep going and released The Middle as the second song from the album in October of 2001, less than a month after the attacks. It just takes some time, little girl, in a little out the ride. Which turned out to be the right choice. Lyrically, it was exactly what people needed to hear as they were trying to heal from 9/11 and get a sense that yes, things would be all right. And the song is just insanely catchy and upbeat, like it just makes you feel so good to hear that chorus. It's one of those songs that really transcends time and genre. Like you could play it for just about anybody of any age who's into any kind of music, and they're gonna sing along to it. It's just that good of a song. And supported by a music video that was also brilliant, it got a ton of airplay on MTV's TRL at the time when that show was just an insanely popular hit-making machine. And on the back of all of that, The Middle became a massive crossover mainstream hit, reaching number 5 on the Billboard Top 100. And before I go on, 55% of you are not subscribed. So hit that subscribe button, it helps out the channel a lot and it makes sure that you don't miss any videos. Their follow-up single, Sweetness, also did really well. The album quickly went platinum, and the band toured relentlessly for the next 2 years, riding the wave of success from The Middle. It's really kind of an amazing story that seems like something out of a movie. In just 24 months, the band went from getting dropped by Capitol and literally barely having enough money to eat, to selling out arenas and having a platinum album. And all of that set the stage for their next album, Futures, which came out in 2004, featuring the lead single, Pain. It takes my pain away. It's a lie. Sonically, the album was darker, more complex, and layered than Bleed American, which, as the band explained, the stripped-down sound on Bleed American was largely because they just didn't have the time and budget to experiment in the studio. Remember, they were paying for that out of their own pocket. And so this album was really more of like a conscious return to the less upbeat, more emo sound of their previous work. As their drummer Zach said, it doesn't really match up with a song like The Middle, but if you listen to the middle section of Clarity, it's very much related to that. And the album did very well, eventually going gold, and it got pretty much universally positive reviews, but they didn't have another hit single on the level of The Middle. Their next album, Chase This Light, had even less hype, was less commercially successful, and that's been true of every Jimmy Eat World album since then. And if you define a hit as a song that reaches the top 40 of the Billboard Hot 100, technically speaking, they are a one-hit wonder. And so from the perspective of the casual fan, it might seem like Jimmy Eat World fell off, like they had tried and failed to replicate the success of Bleed American. But I'm not sure that's actually true at all, because they had always been super clear that their idols were bands like the Pixies or Sonic Youth, who all had some moments of mainstream success, but they never chased it. They just wanted to have a career making music that meant something to them and their most dedicated fans, and that is exactly what they've done. Which brings us to the last question: what is their lasting impact and influence? Well, first of all, I would say that they very arguably did more than anybody else to put quote-unquote real emo on the map back in the early 2000s. Again, real emo meaning that mid-90s emo that was an offshoot of the hardcore scene, starting with Fugazi and going from there. And I'm not taking anything away from the other emo bands of the time, like The Used and Taking Back Sunday, because I think they're genuinely great bands, and I'm definitely going to make a video about both of them in the future. But they were more like what people would call screamo, meaning a little bit more from the Hot Topic side of things. Again, absolutely nothing wrong with that, it's just something different. Whereas with Jimmy Eat World, they were 100% part of that 90s DIY underground scene. They played the same venues as all the bands on the flyers behind me, doing split releases and playing shows with bands like The Promise Ring, Sensefield, Mineral, Sunny Day Real Estate, and so forth. Basically, sweater vest emo as opposed to Hot Topic emo. and the impact of that really can't be overestimated. Emo changed the landscape of music and pop culture forever, and Jimmy Eat World were a big part of making that happen. The Jimmy Eat World to Lil Yachty pipeline is actually very real. They're also one of the fairly uncommon examples of a band whose earlier work ends up getting rediscovered. Like I said, their second album, Clarity, flopped when it came out, and pretty much nobody even knew it existed. But after they blew up with The Middle, millions of people went back to listen to their earlier catalog, and Clarity has since been elevated to the status of a genre-defining classic. And honestly, for good reason. Out of the just absolutely massive number of bands doing that sound in the 90s, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, as somebody who went to a ton of those shows, there were literally hundreds of bands doing it. That album is up there with the absolute best in the genre. Texas is the Reason, Braid, and The Promise Ring. And Jimmy Eat World has outlasted basically every band in the genre. And I find it really interesting that they did all of this without any kind of gimmick or huge personalities. They were always very chill, understated guys that even if you were a fan, you probably wouldn't recognize them at the grocery store. As Jim Adkins said, if you want juicy rock debauchery, we're probably not the best place to look for it. And that may have seemed like a weakness back in the 2000s, when these shocking, larger-than-life artists like Marilyn Manson, Eminem, and Slipknot were dominating the headlines. But I think that was actually the key to Jimmy Eat World's appeal. They found that sweet spot of people who wanted something more substantial than Backstreet Boys or Kid Rock, but didn't necessarily want that over-the-top aggression and edginess of something like Slipknot or Lamb of God. And although they never had another huge hit like The Middle, honestly, I don't think they ever wanted one. They always focused on albums, their live show, and I think more than anything else, the word that describes them to me is honesty. And that may have cost them some short-term success, but I think that's also why they've had so much longevity and why they're now rightly seen as one of the most influential, respected bands in the genre. All right, friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Members get all my podcasts and videos early. There are members-only channels on my Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways sometimes, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video, and with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.